So we're still going to be in Matthew 10, and just the brief, because again, this is a, it's a direct continuation of the conversation that was happening last week that Jesus was having with his disciples, and this is actually going to be kind of part 1 of 2 of what will be going on next week still, because Jesus is still going to be having the conversation going with his disciples. But last week we saw for the first time that Jesus had all of these 12 men. He just called 12. He had these 12 men come together. He brought them to this place, and some of them had been following him for a little bit longer. Some had been recently called. Last week we looked at the ordinary nature of these men. Like, these were just regular guys like us. Like, again, I always want to reiterate that, like, they're not superhuman. They're not super saint. These aren't like some divine beings. These are just some guys. And they're sitting there listening to Jesus. And Jesus is like, I got work for you to do. I'm going to give you my power. I'm going to send you out with my message. And you need to get out into the community and be about these things. But again, they're regular guys called to a huge purpose in this world. It's not different really from what we're called to. Jesus told them to go and preach the kingdom, to leverage the power that he was giving them to do the miraculous, but all for the purpose of seeing people come to know Jesus and to understand the kingdom and to have that relationship repaired with the Lord when we start dealing with sin. Again, Jesus had not finished his sending them out speech yet. Last week he just told them, I'm sending you out. And that's kind of where we stopped. Today we're picking up from that. And so like I said, he just told them he's going to send them out. Today we're picking up in verse 16 through 26. So, like I said, I'm sending you guys out. Starting in verse 16 now, it says, Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. But beware of men, for they will deliver you up to councils and scourge you in the synagogues. You will be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. But when they deliver you up, do not worry about how or what you should speak, for it will be given to you in that hour what you should speak. Now brother will deliver up brother to death, and a father his child, and children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. You will be hated by all for my name's sake. But he who endures to the end will be saved. When they persecute you in this city, flee to another. For assuredly I say to you, you will not have gone through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for a disciple that he be like his teacher, and a servant like his master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebub, how much more will they call those of his household? Therefore, do not fear them, for there is nothing covered that will not be revealed, and hidden that will not be known. So, like I said, it's an interesting one this morning. I want you just to imagine this. This is always me. Like, I'm always like, gosh, what? Again, regular guys. This isn't just a storybook, too. This was a group of guys sitting there with Jesus. Like, Jesus, you just called us to follow you. It's like, guys, I've been doing these things. Like, you've been following me from different amounts of times. You've been seeing me teach. You've been seeing me perform these miracles and all of this other stuff in front of them. But I think of these guys that are sitting in this room at this moment. And Jesus is like, it's time for you guys to get out there and start doing the work as well. Like, you've seen me doing it. I've walked the example. I've shown you. I've taught you some of these things. But before you go, it's like verse 16. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. And it's just like, It's something we've talked about a little bit already. Like we've talked a little bit about this. Jesus has made some other comments in some of his teaching this like up to this point that has caused us to talk about a few of these things already. But it's our main point today to see what Jesus is sharing here. And the fact is that Jesus was never afraid to talk to the people that wanted to follow him about the difficulty of actually following him. Like Jesus wanted to make sure that people understood what they were in for. And he was never shy of putting that there. Like again, I think when we were going through the Sermon on the Mount, a couple people went and asked Jesus, like, I want to follow you, Jesus. And Jesus was like, well, this is what it's going to look like. And they're like, oh, well, let's reconsider this. These guys have already been called to follow Jesus. They already answered the call. They're already sitting with him in the room. They've already been seeing him doing the things. They've already, like, Jesus is sending them out, and Jesus is like, but before you go, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. The middle of a pack of wolves is not a good nor safe place for a sheep to be. And I watched a lot of like National Geographic and Discovery Channel. Like that was like my favorite thing growing up. I was always the animal shows. Like I think Titus asked me not too long ago what my favorite field trip was as a kid, and I was like, man, they took us to the IMAX and we watched this like African Serengeti thing, and you see all the animals attacking stuff. It's like, this is awesome, and I love that stuff. But when you think about that, you think of like Jesus, like you're calling us sheep and you're sending us out into the middle of a bunch of apex predators. Like that's a big deal. Like wolves are, in a lot of the area that wolves live, I mean, they're the top predator in the food chain. Like, you know, that's not where the sheep needs to be going. The sheep is generally a farm animal. Like they are a farm animal. They are for the most part helpless. They don't really have any significant defensive measures. I mean, maybe if there's nobody taking care of them, there's enough wool on them that it might be kind of hard to like eat through the wool. But I mean, it's not probably going to be a major deterrent factor. They don't really have any defensive measures. They're not considered the smartest of animals. It's why sheep need to be looked after by a shepherd. The shepherd's there to keep the sheep where they're supposed to be, because naturally they'll just wander off and die. They'll get eaten by a wolf. They'll walk off a cliff. They'll fall in a hole. Like, I mean, that's what sheep are going to do. The shepherd's there to protect them against the predators, like wolves. That's what the shepherd's there for. So if you were one of the disciples, like at this moment, it's like, oh, Jesus, I'm sending you guys out. You're like, okay, yeah, we're ready to get sent out. And Jesus is like, hold on a second. You're like a bunch of sheep and you're going out to the wolves. I want you to understand this. Like, I think if we were sitting there, like, what would be going through our head when we were, like, if we were hearing this monologue, we're like, yeah, I'm ready to go out for you, Jesus. And Jesus is catching us with this little side point before you go. It's like, Jesus, we're the sheep and you're sending us out to the wolves. Like, sheep aren't supposed to go out to wolves, Jesus. Like, you know that. Sheep are supposed to stay really far away from the wolves. So again, you're thinking like what's the deal, Jesus? Like, you're preparing us, you're sending us out, but you're sending us out to this? Like, why are we getting sent out to the wolf pack? Jesus, are you going to go with us? Can you promise that I'm going to be safe? Like, there's a lot of things that might go through our head if, like, we were sitting there with these men getting told this by Jesus. Like, the reality is, like I said, that we're not completely removed from this situation. Like, Jesus made a very clear call and job in sending out for these guys. But obviously, as we know through Scripture, like, there's a very clear call and a sending out and a prepared for the kingdom work that is on us as well. And so the truth for what Jesus' people were going to face then in culture isn't much different from, well, it is different. Especially, at that time in that place of the world and at our time in our place of the world. But there's people in our time in other places of the world that may face something very similar to what they were going through. But right where we're at, It may be a little bit different functionally, but the truth still stands. And it's something that we need to understand. Like Jesus has tasked us with kingdom work to do. And the reality is that actually following Jesus is still going to come with some difficulty. If you really follow Jesus all the way down the line of what he calls us to, there's going to be some opposition along that line. You know, I said at the beginning, like, I think for obvious reasons, this probably wouldn't be a popular message. Like, oh, I'm going to pick this one out and we're going to go here. Like, this isn't going to be the popular message. That following Jesus will be hard. But it's something that we absolutely can't skip over or ignore. I don't want us to go out with a misguided understanding that following Jesus is supposed to be easier or that everything is going to work out just great. Like everything's going to work out like exactly like we want it to. I don't want us to be misguided in thinking that way. Because the difficulty with that and the unfortunate side of a lot of that teaching going on, it's like where they never deal with the hard side of following Jesus, and people are misguided in not understanding that there's a hard side to following Jesus, is that when it doesn't happen, when the easy, like if we're getting taught just the easy path of following Jesus, then when that doesn't happen, that's oftentimes what shakes people's faith. Because maybe we were taught that, following Jesus was going to be all sunshine and rainbows. And then when the storm gets here, then it's like the questions start coming, like, is this real? Like, Jesus, are you who you say you are? Like, maybe like this is just hard and I'm done following you. Like this isn't what I signed up for. When we look at a passage like this and when we see Jesus calling people to follow him, I want us to be prepared. I want us to understand. I don't want us to be surprised. I don't want us to be shaken when things change. I want us to know what Jesus is preparing his disciples for in this moment. And like I said, our world circumstances are a little bit different. Like some of the things that Jesus is going to talk about their situation may not be exactly ours, but there is still difficulty on the path of really following Jesus. And if we're not understanding and prepared for that, then that's where people get really tripped up. Jesus was sending these guys out. He was getting them ready for the issues that they would be facing in the real world, and we absolutely need that preparation too. Like I said, I've seen it in people, and I understand. It's like, people are like, going forward on the path and they hit the speed bump. But nobody ever told me that the speed bump was going to be there. It's just like we have that opportunity right now through what Jesus is teaching us to just say, hey, like there's going to be some bumps along the road. Drive careful. Prepare for them. Like if you hit some these communities out here, like the speed bumps are so huge that if you hit one of those going too fast, like you're going to destroy your car. And it's just like, but somebody could have just, well, hopefully it's painted enough so you see it, but we can also tell you that it's going to be there. And so we can, live, or in that scenario, drive in a proper way so that it's not as big of a deal. But again, Jesus continues in this, like that first statement, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. But he continues on in the second half of that verse. In verse 16 again, I'll read just the whole of verse 16 again. It says, behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. If you're anything like me, like anytime I see the word serpent in the Bible, it just immediately makes me think of the serpent in the Garden of Eden and with Adam and Eve. And she's like, be like a serpent. I'm like, I don't want to be anything like the serpent. It's like, it always just automatically makes me think of, Satan in the Garden of Eden as the serpent. But Jesus isn't talking about that serpent here, obviously. When Jesus says that we need to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves, he's talking about this really practical, again, it's like another National Geographic moment. There's this really practical understanding that, like, most people and a lot of other creatures don't like snakes. Like, snakes are not a popular animal. Like, I don't think anyone here is going to be like, oh, look, snake. I mean, I like reptiles. But still, I'm not going to want to run into a poisonous snake or something. Like, I don't mind like holding somebody's pet snake or something. But snakes, I'm sure, have learned through all of their existence in time that there's a lot of creatures and humans and stuff that will very likely kill them if they are out in the open, because they pose a threat to people and to other animals and all of these things. So when Jesus is talking about this, there's this idea behind there that's like, kind of like, be like the snake. The snake's not like just, like looking to get itself hurt. Like, it's gonna take some steps, and it's gonna do some things so that, it's avoiding the getting in trouble. It's avoiding something trying to kill it. It's avoiding this. Like, it's avoiding harm in those ways. It's staying in cover. It's avoiding harm. And Jesus is like, we can learn something from that. It's like, don't go looking for trouble. Like, if you're the snake and you're just like, cruising up to people, like, people aren't going to respond well to the snake. It's like, one, don't be like this snake, but also don't be just cruising up to places where like the harm for you is going to be. Snakes are pretty good at staying in the shadows and just kind of staying in the background and doing their thing and such. But the point, like the bigger issue here that Jesus is bringing when he talks about the snake and the dove, it's like don't put yourself in harm's way necessarily. Like, there's some ways and reasons why you would need to be in a certain situation, and especially in the cause of Christ. But it's like, don't actively be part of the problem in which you're going to get, harmed. But then the flip side of that is like the dove. It's like, don't be actively seeking a situation where you're going to be harmed like the snake, but also be like the dove, where we're not actively trying to cause harm to anybody. It's this place of, seeking to be at peace with people. The Bible talks many times about our efforts and our call to seek to be at peace with the people around us. And there's this understanding here with the snake. It's like, the snake and what it does, doesn't bring peace to the situation necessarily. So they kind of, they stay away from the places that are going to cause them harm. And like the dove's not causing harm to anybody, maybe to an insect or something. But it's not like actively causing harm to other creatures around it. Jesus is like, you can learn something from these two different animals. So according to Jesus' instruction, we're to be avoiding trouble when we can, like the snake, and we're to be harmless to others, like the dove. We see, like, practically, and we've talked about this before, we see practically these situations where, like, some people, they go out, they go out claiming the name of Jesus, but go out in such a way where, like, they're stirring up trouble. Like, they're going out stirring up trouble in the name of Jesus. And when you look at the way that Jesus teaches these things, and we look at, a few weeks ago, the compassion that he felt for people, when you see him, kind of giving these analogies of peaceful manners that we engage with people, when you see the rest of Scripture that talks about how we should engage with people, it's like going out in those ways isn't really conducive or productive for what Jesus has called us to do. A lot of people go out and stir up trouble, but that's not how we're supposed to be ministering to people. That's not how Jesus is instructing his disciples right now. I said, let's not be troublemakers. The Bible says, like I just mentioned a minute ago, there's a verse in Romans 12:18. And it's right in the middle of the passage that, sometimes our Bibles, they have these little headings over some of the paragraphs. And that one, like in my Bible, I think it says, behave like a Christian. That's the heading for that particular passage in Romans 12. But in Romans 12:18, it says that we need to do our best to be at peace with all men. So that teaches us, that we don't go out as troublemakers. We go out as peacemakers with the gospel of Jesus Christ. That doesn't mean, though, that sometimes the message and Jesus himself isn't going to ruffle some feathers. Like, that's the reality of it. That's why, as we continue in Matthew 10, that's why that even if we do these things, even if we do them in the right way, we're still probably going to run into difficulty sometimes. Jesus knows this. Of course he knows this. When you read 17 through 20 in Matthew 10, starting in 17. So it's right after the, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. It says, but beware of men, for they will deliver you up to councils and scourge you in their synagogues. You will be brought before governors and kings for my sake as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. But when they deliver you up, do not worry about how or what you should speak, for it will be given to you in that hour what you should speak. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. Jesus talks here about the reality at that time that his disciples, as they were going out at that moment, in that culture, at that time, that there was a very real element that they were going to face problems from government, from law enforcement, from governing officials, that they were going to face problems on all of these fronts. He's telling these guys, he's like, you're going to be brought before the councils. You're going to be brought before governors and kings. It says there they're going to be scourged or even whipped in the synagogues, right in front of all the religious people. But Jesus says in verse 18 there, he says, you will be brought before governors and kings for my sake. He's telling them that even in those moments, even when the government and the law enforcement, even when all of these people are coming against you, that there is still yet opportunity in that moment to be a testimony for Jesus and for his teaching and his purposes here on this earth. He's like, Jesus tells them when that time comes, and it's very practical too, because some of these guys hadn't been following Jesus all that long yet. It's like, I don't know how much some of these guys have been taught. Think of Matthew. Matthew just got called not that long ago. We don't know the exact time breakdown of how long ago that was, but in the record of this gospel, it was pretty close to when this time is. So Matthew may not, have it all learned yet. So Jesus, really practically, he's like, okay, you guys are going out for me, and you're going to get into these situations, and they're going to bring you before all these leaders. They're going to try you for these things. He's like, you may not know what to say in those. You might not have the words to speak. But he's like, don't worry. It's like when you get to those moments, it's a supernatural element here that even if you don't have the words to speak, the very Spirit of God inside of you will bring the words to bear. You will bear testimony of me in these situations. And it's where it's a great Jesus thing too. He's taking a hyper negative situation of man, you guys are going to be tried, and law enforcement's going to grab you, they're going to bring you before the rulers, you're going to be whipped and stuff. And Jesus is like, but you're going to have an opportunity in that moment. There's an opportunity there. You're going to have words to speak. You're going to be a testimony to me. It's a really bad thing, but it's got to be a pretty good thing too. It's a total Jesus moment. But it's incredible that Jesus is teaching them that the very Spirit of God would come to bear in that moment, give them the words to speak so that they could testify the truth of Jesus in those situations. Luckily for us, thankfully for us, I am super thankful. At this moment in time that we live in, I don't think we necessarily have this issue. We don't go out with the concern, we're not going out this week. Again, we end this service, I'm go out, be part of Jesus' mission in this world. Tell people about him, invite them to church, minister to people. But in us going out and doing that, I don't think any of us has a concern of I'm going to get caught up by the police doing that. I'm going to be, I'm going to be in court 2 weeks from now. I'm going to get, whipped somewhere. We don't have, we're not living with that concern right now. We have brothers and sisters around the world right now that are actually living with that concern right now. But we don't. And that always should kind of, get us thinking in a sense too. It's man, we don't have that concern. So should we be pushing harder? Yeah, probably. But the crazy thing is that usually these things, I don't know, a lot of times the mission is fueled by the fires of difficulty and such. So I've had so many conversations over the years of the people so concerned about these things and such, and I'm always one that's I'm not wishing that day gets here, but I actually think it'd be really good for the mission of the church if it did. But it's something to think about, and it's the reason why we have to understand a passage like this, because if it ever does, we need to be prepared for it. Like I said, I'm not one that I'm not sitting here really concerned about that. Like I don't think we're at any point in time where we have a soon expectation that, you know, government is going to be actively oppressing and arresting like people talking about Jesus. Like I don't think we're anywhere near that. Like I had a conversation with somebody a few years ago, like they're not going to let us have Bibles anymore. They're passing the law right now. I'm like, calm down. No, they're not. Like that's not happening. Like I don't know where you're getting that from. Like even somebody that doesn't believe in what you believe, they still probably believe that you should be able to have your Bible. Like I'm not concerned about that. But then I challenged him and I was just like, but if it does happen, what does it change? Like what does it change? Like if that law gets passed, are you going to change your ownership of a Bible? Are you going to change your stance with Jesus? Are you going to change needing to still be part of his mission on this earth? Are you going to change this? Because if you will change in that moment, then something needs to change right now. Like something's wrong. Like you're not resolved enough in your relationship with Christ and his purpose for you on this earth to be ready for that. Maybe you've never dealt with a passage like this where Jesus was like, guys, like, I'm calling you to this and it's probably not going to be easy. It's definitely not. For these guys, it's really not going to be easy. For us, like, it's not as hard for us right now. But even in the little things, like, even in the little speed bumps, I don't want us to get tripped up in them. I think if we press harder, if we go farther, if we do more, I think the more we do, the more opposition we'll see. But do we get ready for it? Do we pursue it? Or would we shy away from it because it might be difficult? I don't want us to. And if the day ever comes, like I said, where things change for these things, I hope we don't waver. Because he's so much bigger and greater and has changed everything. That those are kind of the little, and that's kind of going to be the contrasting point between this week and next week, is why you'd see like why we wouldn't waver. But again, Jesus is still talking to these guys, and Jesus keeps the good news coming for them. You know, it's the government, law enforcement, oppression, and all of those things. And he gets to verse 21, and it's moved from the government, now it's moved to family. And in 21, he says, brother will deliver up brother to death, and father his child, and children will rise against parents and cause them to be put to death. You will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end will be saved. When they persecute you in the city, flee to another. For assuredly I say to you, you will not have gone through the city of Israel before the Son of Man comes. It's this crazy thing. It's like brothers are going to like rat out their brother. Like fathers are going to turn in their own children. Children will turn on their parents. Jesus speaks really plainly, and it's like in that moment in time for these people, he's like, some people are going to be put to death over this. Again, he's not mincing words. He's not sugarcoating it. He's just like, the reality is you go out right now, is you are going to face harm. And some of the people hearing this message, if they're serious about it and they believe in me and they start following me, they might face harm too, all the way to death. And the end result is they still go out, even in face of all of those things. But again, it's the family dynamic, it's the home dynamic. But the key to all of this that we've talked about, again, earlier it was, you will go before these kings and rulers for my sake. Here in verse 22, it says, you will be hated by all for my name's sake. This is the key to understanding why all of this is the way that it is. There's a passage in John 15 I want to look at. We'll just go to this one. But John 15. Like, this is just why it is the way that it is. John 15, starting in verse 18. We're just going to read a couple verses. Starting in verse 18, it says, if the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. If they kept my word, they will keep yours also. But all these things they will do to you for my name's sake, because they do not know him who sent me. Again, as Jesus is giving this word of warning to his disciples, he's like, you're going to have to go through these things. Like, you're going to have to go through these things. But just know that you're going through these things because of me. Like, he is the root cause of the issues. He's the dividing point. And I said, like, he told them that people are going to hate them. And the likely thing is, like, people will not like us, potentially even hate us if we talk about these things. But it's good because of him. Hopefully we don't approach people in such a way, we talked about it before. Hopefully we don't approach people in a dumb way that gives them good reason to not like us. Because that's unfortunate. That's not what Jesus is telling us to do. He says, go harmless as the dove. He talks about the compassion that he has for people. He talks about patience and love for other people. He talks about loving our neighbor. And yet people still go out in crazy ways. They wonder why people don't like them. And then they're like, oh, I'm getting persecuted. No, you're getting the result of your actions. You're getting the consequences of your words and your actions. Let people, if people aren't going to like us, let them not like us because of Jesus, not because we've chosen to act poorly. Like, people will not like Jesus, but that's inherent. Let it not be because we've earned it. Through all of this hard news that Jesus is sharing, there's still a promise in the middle of this. In verse 22, Jesus says, you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end will be saved. There's this promise here that if we weather this through with him, that if we keep going, if we stay on the path, if we stay on the path of following Jesus through all of these things, that if we endure to the end, that he's got us. That's his promise there. It's not that we're saved by doing these actions. It's not that we're saved by going through difficulty. It's just that our salvation is evidenced by making it to the end with him for his purposes. It's like, you guys, if you get to the end of this road, you will get to the end of this road with me. And when you get there, you'll be saved. Because you've endured to the end with him. Said it's not salvation through works, it's you're saved. Jesus carried you to the end. You made it. I think of Paul, where it's like Paul's like, I went through all of these crazy things in my life. I was beaten, I was shipwrecked, I was stoned, all of these things. He's like, I fought the fight, I've run the race. And he's like, and then even at that moment when he was writing that, and he's like, I'm about to be put to death. He's like, I've made it. I've made it to the end. He says, I've done everything that Jesus called me to do. I'm ready to go. He endured to the end with Jesus. He made it. He did it all that he was supposed to do. He saw death in front of him, and yet he was still, I'm good. Because he knew he was preserved. He knew he was saved at that moment. Even, like I said, going through all that stuff, and in the face of death, he's like, I'm good. I endured to the end with Jesus, and he's got me. That's what Jesus is promising here. So there is a promise here if we make it to the end with him, and we will. We get to the last big point of this, the last point. Verses 24 through 26, Jesus says, a disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for a disciple that he be like his teacher, and a servant like his master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebub, how much more will they call those of his household? Therefore, do not fear them, for there is nothing that is covered that will not be revealed, and there's nothing hidden that will not be known. It says, a disciple is not above his teacher, and a servant is not above his master. This is the very same point that John made when we read John a minute ago, where he says, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. That's what Jesus said in the book of John. It's the same thing that he's saying here. He's just like, it's Jesus. Like, we're following him. And if we're following him and he's going through difficulty, like, you follow him through the difficulty. He's like, I'm not taking that away from you. He's like, if I'm going to go through it, like the people that follow me are going to go through it too. Jesus says in verse 25 there, he's like, they literally called me Beelzebub. And that's another word for Satan. He's like, they're literally calling me Satan. What do you think they're going to call you? It's like, if they call me Satan, like, what are they going to call you guys? He's just making the point to them. He's preparing them. Jesus said that we'll never be above him, and we rightly should never be above him. And if he had to go through these things, then there's an expectation for us. But he says there that it is enough for a disciple that he be like his teacher and a servant to be like his master. That's something we should want more than anything else in this world. Like Jesus says, he's telling these guys, go out, do what I'm calling you to do. Just know when you go out, there's going to be some hard things along that path. But understand that that's my path. And for you guys even in walking this path have an opportunity for the servant to be like the master, for the student to be like the teacher. I hope that there is nothing more that we would want in this world than to be like Jesus. Jesus is giving that opportunity, that analogy here. The goal of every disciple of Jesus Christ should be to be like him. Jesus' point today, as we read this, Jesus' point isn't doom and gloom. It's not like, everything's going to be terrible. It's not that. But it's just, don't be caught off guard when there's difficulty. Like, this isn't doom and gloom. This is a reality check. This is like, know what we really stand for. Be willing to walk even if it gets hard. Know that we can stand with him and endure to the end. And if we get to the end, which we will, he's got us. He promises that. But just don't be, like, we just can't be ignorant to the fact that the road's going to have some problems along the road. Like, there's going to be some problems along the road. If we get caught off guard by that, that's where we're going to get tripped up. But if we walk forward knowing it, then we'll be ready when we get there. I think it's in 1 Peter 2 or whatever, where it says, gird up the loins of your mind and prepare for what lies ahead. Like, prepare for battle, basically. It's like, get your mind ready. That's what Peter was saying. He's, get your mind ready for battle. Like, know that the fight's coming. Anticipate what is coming. Because if we anticipate it, we'll be able to deal with it better when it gets here. If we go and we're like, whoa, surprised by it, usually the fight doesn't go as well when you're surprised by something. But if you're ready, you're prepared, you're anticipating, then we can deal with the situation better, and we can deal with it with him. But notice, through all of this, again, it's not all doom and gloom, but this is also the transition point to where, Jesus is going to take these things and it's going to transition it to where we're going to be at next week. Jesus makes this statement. He's like, through all of this passage, all of these warnings, to talking about the wolves, talking about government persecution, talking about families turning on each other, talking about hatred and fleeing from people, name calling, all of these other things. Jesus comes to verse 26 and he says, therefore do not fear them. It's like, I just warned you about all of these things. Jesus is like, yeah, don't fear them. Therefore, do not fear them. And that's a really interesting turn in this conversation that he is having with his disciples. But it's a turn towards the direction that we're going to be talking about next week as we continue in this chapter again. But after everything that Jesus said, after every warning that he gave, Jesus says, don't fear the people that are doing all of these things. Like, this passage may be a rough one to deal with. It's not a popular passage to go through. This isn't the passage you're going to teach to draw the people in. Like, that's not this. This is the reality. This is the reality of following Jesus. And it's completely true. But there is a very hopeful statement at the end of even a hard passage. It's really, there's light at the end of the tunnel. And hopefully next week, we'll understand why a lot more clearly. There's going to be a massive perspective shift that we're going to be talking about as we compare what we talked about this week and what Jesus is going to be teaching us next week. It's a matter of eternal everything perspective, and we're going to deal with it. But we're going to save it. So with that, let's pray.